Welcome to Hands-on AI Supervision by UNESCO. This series highlights the practical experiences, technical insights, and strategic priorities identified by experts working on the front lines of AI oversight. This interview series is funded by the European Union and is part of UNESCO's broader work on the ethical governance of AI.
Welcome back to another episode of UNESCO's Hands-on AI Supervision Lessons from Practice. My name is Mirela Kmetic-Marceau, and I'm a project consultant at UNESCO working on the Supervising AI by Competent Authority project. And today we have a really exciting guest with us, Rumman Chowdhury, who is founder and CEO of Humane Intelligence, as well as US Science Envoy for AI in the Biden administration. Rumman, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. Glad to be here.
So just to start, I would let you introduce yourself a bit further to our listeners, a bit more about your background, how it relates to AI supervision, but also about your organization and the topics you had discussed with participants in September.
Absolutely. And thank you for having me on the podcast. Really excited to be here. So I have been working in the field of responsible AI and AI governance for about 9 years at this point, starting off working at Accenture, building their global responsible AI practice. By background, I'm a data scientist and a social scientist. I've been in tech in general for almost 15 years, specifically working on issues of how technology intersects with humanity. And with UNESCO, I've actually a long history with UNESCO, a very positive one. I've had really wonderful collaborations and folks I've worked with, in particular on your teams focused on technology facilitated gender-based violence. We actually published with UNESCO one of the first reports, if not the first reports, on generative AI and TFGPV, which then sparked further work, including a red teaming exercise that we held with the actual UNESCO delegations, and also a report on red teaming for social good. And the intent of all of that work is to make AI observability, test and evaluation more accessible to people who are not AI developers. One of the most important things, and this is what Humane Intelligence and my personal mission is, one thing I'm focused on is creating the independent community of evaluators. How can everybody be literate in critical thinking and understanding of AI systems? I started Humane Intelligence, the nonprofit, co-founded it a few years ago, and that organization still exists. Today, I run Humane Intelligence Public Benefit Corporation, which is actually building the infrastructure for AI evaluations.
Thank you very much. Maybe just to dive right into the questions. As you mentioned red teaming, you mentioned kind of building this kind of capacity for evaluating AI systems. So if we go back to red teaming is increasingly discussed as something that can help people that supervise AI in terms of the public servants, civil servants that are that have the responsibility, whether it's in Europe through the AI Act or through other local legislation around the globe. Red teaming is increasingly discussed. But supervisory authorities have very different mandate depending on where they're at, their expertise, but also their resources. So is it fair to say that some level of red teaming literacy will be relevant for all authorities involved in the supervision of AI?
Well, we are already seeing some mandates coming out of the EU, as well as some in the US and other parts of the world. In particular, Korea and Japan have a particularly strong stance and very clear perspectives on red teaming. And you are correct, like the mandates for conducting them are very different across the board. I think that does present an opportunity, and it does actually showcase some of the confusion. So that's why at the Humane Intelligence Public Benefit Corporation, we're building out infrastructure for evaluations. First of all, we have no standards of how to evaluate AI, generative AI models. They're very, very different from machine learning models. And governments are faced with the difficult task of grappling this problem, understanding artificial intelligence and building artificial intelligence all at the same time. So it's not easy. It's understandable that we would have a wide range of approaches. Now, what's important for governments to think about, and we actually work closely with some governments and have government clients that we've helped do this for, is how do you create interoperability so that even if you do have differing legislation, which is totally normal, it does not result in confusion and sort of mismatched expectations, as well as frankly hefty legal fees for everybody involved to just understand what everybody's asking for. And we don't want redundancy in this work. The purpose of red teaming, just to take a step back, is to identify the potential risks of AI models with the intent of mitigating them, right? It's not a punitive exercise. It's not even an audit. It's actually a method of AI assurance. And AI assurance specifically defined as whether or not the AI model or the product that you're building is performing as you have intended. That is the purpose of red teaming here. And what's great about the practice is that we can actually create wholly inclusive exercises where a wide range of people are able to contribute. And again, this goes back to helping you build better models.
Thank you very much for this. And maybe on the same vein, you talk about interoperability and how there might be divergence between the context, but then there is still this kind of some ways to go about it that might apply to all contexts as well. And you mentioned it in your intro about your work with UNESCO and about this red teaming for AI playbook that you developed with UNESCO. And I actually wanted to touch on it because I think it's a really interesting publication and I encourage everyone to read it through. It's very concise, but provides a lot of insights for how to do red teaming for social good and for with kind of a gender outlook. But I think there's the possibility there also to use this kind of publication for a wider range of applicability. And that's where my question would go, is kind of what lessons from this playbook that you've developed with UNESCO could we extrapolate lessons from for specifically AI supervision in a context for regulators to kind of take insights from that and to apply to their own context?
Absolutely. And I'm, first of all, very grateful for the patronage and support of Begonia Lagazabaster and Danielle Clichet, Sinead Andrews, and the entire team, the gender team that we worked with. And while going backwards from the playbook, the intent of the playbook was actually to give people a practical guide. I think what we have today is a lot of frameworks and concepts, and we literally wanted to write a step-by-step guide. And again, for a lot of NGOs, civil society organizations, and governments, red teaming is often seen as a very confusing technical exercise, and we really wanted to make it approachable and accessible. Now, we utilized the gender lens as an example. So why did we choose that lens? So first, obviously, it was through that team. But second, I think importantly, gender presents one of those issues where answers are not very clear cut. And frankly, organizations and governments are the hardest questions they will have to answer is how do we red team AI? How do we understand the issues of AI as it relates to things that are not clear cut yes and no answers, right? So embedded biases, hidden biases, cultural biases, that kind of thing. So for example, if we intersect culture and gender, we start to see a wide range of issues that are quite different than just looking at gender alone, just as an example. And again, bias is not necessarily always as clear as yes or no, right or wrong. Sometimes it's embedded. I think one common example people use is that if you ask an AI model to make doctors, it will often refer to them as male or just make men. And if it's a nurse, then it will overwhelmingly be women. Now, that is a bias of a particular direction. Now, what is also interesting is the way we red team is we actually present scenarios and we help people craft scenarios. And these scenarios are meant to mimic real world situations, right? And again, it helps you understand the hidden ways in which bias gets embedded into these models. So, in terms of governments using and NGOs, using this playbook, it is really intended to be truly a step-by-step guide. And we use the gender lens as an example to demonstrate that even difficult to tackle topics or, things that, again, don't always have a clear yes or no answer are things that you can red team and frankly should red team for. The last thing I'll say is, there are multiple things you can red team, just to be very specific and a little bit technical about it. What the AI model companies put out into the world are model capabilities red teaming, which means that they take the model in basically a bubble and they say, if you lived in an infinite universe where you could do whatever you wanted, how would this model perform? So you may have seen studies about how would an AI run an economy? Well, but the reality is hopefully we're not going to let AI systems just run economies with no institutional control or individuals, right? So when AI companies do that, they're basically they're doing a different scenario from what governments and civil society organizations should be doing, because these institutions, governments, CSOs, et cetera, are interested in the real world, right? So they want to understand the socio-technical impact this AI model in the real world. You can also, frame red teaming around policy. So if you create a framework, can you test this AI model against your framework to demonstrate not just the model's performance, but whether or not your framework is comprehensive? We did exactly that for NIST and CISA, where we took a NIST operations and control document, 600-1, and we red teamed it, tested it against multiple different models just to see how it performed. And the last thing you can test are guardrails. So guardrails are technical systems built on top of foundation models to help fine-tune and guide what the model should or should not be doing. Just as an example, if you are making an AI writing tutor, you may explicitly put in controls to ensure that children are not plagiarizing, and that would be on top of the existing model. So you can actually test that guardrail. So again, when governments are thinking about red teaming, it's not a monolith. There are many things you can test, and that impacts the kinds of groups you test with.
Thank you very much. And I think that's a really interesting discussion because I think we hear the word red teaming a lot in the policy world. And we have this kind of notion that it's very technical or that it needs to be done by experts that have a certain background or things like that. And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what you're mentioning here is that yes, this is a possibility, but there's also many different ways to go about it. So maybe just to build on that is, you mentioned the different ways we can red team and the different why we would want to do it. Do you think there's any skills or capabilities that the people in supervisory authorities, which is kind of what this project aims to increase their capacity, so people that supervise AI on a daily basis, so skills and capabilities that they would actually need or they would need to kind of enhance and develop to make sure that they can kind of do the red teaming exercises in a way that is as beneficial as possible?
Yes, and we get into this in the guide a bit. Like actually need subject matter experts in the topic, not just artificial intelligence, to help you shape what you should be testing. So specifically, the kind of red teaming that I think many governments are going to want to do is not just cybersecurity red teaming. It's actually unintended consequences. Why is that important? In cybersecurity red teaming, you are play acting the role of a malicious actor, someone trying to hack into a system. And that is a very different mindset from unintended consequences, where you're actually mimicking a regular person who is interacting with the model normally, but then has a bad reaction, a bad output from the AI system. And that's in many ways more difficult to mimic, right? The strategies look different. You have to kind of create like this natural scenario. So, one of the most important things to think about is, what is an expert and what kind of expertise do you need? The second, and this is critically important, red teaming is a tool of science, not a tool of policy. And what do I mean by that? It's not to say that policymakers can't use it. Policymakers should be using it, but not to use it as a tool or form of persuasion. What I often see, what my colleague refers to as policy-driven data, which is that people utilize red teaming as a method of proving their point rather than entering in with a hypothesis that is disprovable. And just to make that more specific, the intent of red teaming is not to show that the model is biased. You enter with the question, is the model biased? And you would have to have an idea of how you are testing that. In other words, you have to be open to the idea that maybe the AI model is not biased, and what would that look like? All too often, I see people coming in with an idea in their head and they manipulate the AI model until it says what they want it to. Because the reality is you can get these models to say just about anything. And especially if you're talking about quite subtle issues of society, and again, things that are not clearly black and white, for example, gender bias, cultural bias, it is pretty easy to get the model to do these things. Now, if the intent is just to have a media moment, then I guess go do it that way. But I think most people listening to this podcast and most governments actually want to use it as a tool of evaluation, in which case there needs to be a little bit more scientific structure around it. So in terms of what policymakers can upskill on, that's really the big one. It's how can you learn to create scientific evaluative structure and institutions that are more about identifying issues from a risk mitigation perspective and addressing them, and not just trying to just have a big media moment around where AI is working and not working.
Thank you. And towards kind of throughout this project, what we've been doing at UNESCO is doing kind of trainings with civil servants, so to build their capacity to supervise AI. And a lot of the things we hear from those supervisors on the ground is that AI is kind of this new topic in the public sphere, but towards the policymaker side and the supervisory side, it's going to be people that are already supervising other products or supervising other spheres like personal data and things like that. And on top of this, they will have to also supervise AI, but in a way that aligns with their kind of institutional mandate. Do you think that this is something that is beneficial when it comes to red teaming? Because you mentioned that you need to have the technical people for the technical part of red teaming, but you also need to have subject matter expert in, for example, culture or gender. Here I'm thinking about if you look at a model for transportation or for a medical device or things like that. Do you think that this could actually be one of the kind of a better tool for supervisory authority to kind of rely on this broad range of expertise that they already have?
Absolutely. I consider red teaming, I have a specific name for it. I call it structured public feedback. It's ways of getting input from the public or, non-developers in a way that actually is structured and formatted in a way that is useful for developers. All too often, we rely on workshops or design thinking sessions, which are great in the early days of product development when you don't really have a shape of a product yet. But post-development, it's very difficult to do user experience research, especially as it relates to AI model development. So obviously, if it's about user design, product design, et cetera, I think it makes a lot of sense. We have not yet figured out what the user experience research method is for generative AI models. And I truly do believe that to be red teaming of a particular type, right? So red teaming is divided into multiple types. There's expert red teaming, and then there's public red teaming. And they serve different purposes. As you mentioned, the purpose of testing for cultural biases is not to get a bunch of AI engineers together and identify cultural biases, is actually to get cultural and language experts and to do that. But again, for these people, they'll enter the room and they'll be like, oh, maybe they're intimidated by the technology, maybe they've not really used it before, they don't really understand. So there is a bit of education, and I think it's important and useful education broadly. You mentioned medical professional. I think doctors and professionals in general, doctors, lawyers, et cetera, are some of the best people to be doing this work because they have a clearly very advanced and specialized skill set. Now, what you have to do is actually train them on how to do this kind of testing. And what you find is they're generally very enthusiastic. My organization has done red teaming with on education and ed tech with teachers, administrators, ed tech experts, and students. And overwhelmingly, they said, thank you for actually asking our opinion. We're constantly sold educational technologies and everybody's telling us we have to adopt these things, but nobody's ever asked what we need and what's useful for us. So first of all, it's a great way to get community feedback on how a product should be built in a way that is actually meaningful and applied. Second is that actually it improves AI literacy. So when people test these models, they learn more about how to critically evaluate the output of these models, which is a very, very useful skill that everybody needs to have. So that's second. And then third, the product that is built is actually better at solving the problem, right? I think at the end of the day, again, this is why it's a tool of AI assurance. People are making claims about what their model can do. Okay, well, let's go test and prove these claims, whether or not this is true.
That's very, very interesting. So you're kind of saying that in a way, for AI supervisory authority and the people that supervise AI, doing the red teaming is not only a good thing in the sense of doing the evaluation of the product itself, but it's also building capacity for the supervisors themselves in a way that it's kind of a two-way learning street with the product in this sense.
Exactly, absolutely. I think there's a lot for developers to learn from people, and then also people can learn more about how to utilize. The other thing I'll add is people walk away from these evaluation exercises more enthusiastic about AI. I think one of the points of intimidation is A, feeling like they are not part of the conversation, B, just this sort of learning curve, the hurdle, and then C, feeling like they don't know whether or not they can trust the output. Doing well-designed red teaming exercises with expert testers actually solves for all three of them. And again, when, let's say, a doctor is then sold an AI system, separately through some sort of vendor, not only are they better able to ask questions, right? Like they understand what they should be asking, how they should be evaluating this tool. It actually does lead to better adoption because it leads to more informed adoption.
That's very interesting. And maybe just to circle back to one of the things you raised at the beginning, and one of the concerns that was raised by supervisors and practitioners that participated in the UNESCO event in September and participated in the session you did with the posters, was that one of the concern was that there's an absence of clear and AI-specific frameworks for red teaming. And I know you're working on that with human intelligence and with the work you do. But is there kind of the current practices that are used for AI? Do they mostly come from the industry side, or do they mostly come from the CSO side? Or is there really public sector examples that you would say, look, you're in this country, you want to do red teaming, you should look at this country to try to get kind of a good practice example, basically?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think one of the best guides to red team was actually published by the Japan AI Safety Institute. They have a very excellent documentation on how they've conducted red teaming as a government entity, and how it should be structured. I think it's still a growing art. So at NeurIPS, which was really what, like 2 weeks ago, there were even papers on not just how to red team, but actually the evaluation part, like how do you evaluate the data that comes out. So it is still a growing practice. So again, as I mentioned at the top of the podcast, we don't actually have good methods of evaluating generative AI systems. Unlike machine learning systems and other, for example, tree-based AI systems, the generative AI models are probabilistic, not deterministic, meaning that in some cases, 2 plus 2 is 4, and in other cases, 2 plus 2 can be 93, but generally 2 plus 2 is somewhere between, 2.8 and 4.3, right? This is very different from a statistical model, a deterministic model, where the output, it will always be 4. 2 plus 2 will always be 4. And that's important because, again, if you are trying to say this with certainty, this is how the model will perform, a probabilistic system makes it difficult. It doesn't make it impossible. It's actually a lot of very fascinating probabilistic math that is designed around this. But again, we are still figuring out how to do this. Add to the fact that, by the way, we're not just dealing with numbers, we're actually dealing with words or images or sounds that we translate into numbers, right? Which makes it even more complicated because there is a fidelity loss there as well. And then add the complication of that, it gets put into the real world. So I do want to emphasize also that your only answer to fixing the output of AI models is not always going back to the model and fundamentally changing the data or changing, one can also change the front end user experience. Just as an example, we did a red teaming exercise with an education client, one of the largest education companies in the world, actually, earlier this year. And most of their changes were design based. So things like if you want to prevent students from plagiarizing, you make it you make it so that they cannot copy paste the content in the window, just as an example. Or you limit the output to 150 words or fewer, right? You don't let them, the window to ask the questions is smaller, right? So it's a design-based nudging, but it's front-end design versus everything does not have to go back to fundamentally changing the model.
That's really interesting, and it actually touches a lot on the next question that I was going to ask, and that's about how AI is AI fundamentally different from other red teaming purposes? And I think what you've just discussed about kind of looking at the front end and not just the data is something that supervisors might find really interesting, because we have this notion that to be able to kind of fix the problems that we see when we do this evaluation, you always have to go back to square zero, like to the start. But I think that what you're saying is that with AI, there's definitely this possibility of looking at other steps in the output kind of chain here.
Yes, that's exactly correct. So I think, one of the big benefits of these sorts of evaluative exercises is actually as a regulatory tool, right? So it gives you very clear output on model performance, but also, again, it's a way in which multi-stakeholder governance, which is something that people have been doing for quite some time now, actually gets codified into something quite tangible.
That's a great way to phrase it, I think. And maybe as a last practical takeaway, and I know this is a hard question, but we've been asking that all throughout this series, is what would be your top recommendation for supervisory authorities that want to strengthen their red teaming capacity? What would be like your top one thing for them to start doing today to be able to do that?
I think first is to build out your multi-stakeholder governance strategy, and then red teaming can fit within that quite clearly, because this sort of evaluative work needs clear owners to have clear accountability mechanisms. The purpose of this is not, again, to like make a media moment, it's to actually create institutions of governance. Red teaming is a technical tool, but it needs the right institutions to support it.
Thank you very much. I think that's a good way to end the episode. Thank you, Rumman, for joining us and for participating in this episode.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
You've been listening to Hands-on AI Supervision, an interview series by UNESCO. This series highlights the practical experiences, technical insights, and strategic priorities identified by experts working on the front lines of AI oversight. To continue the conversation and learn more about UNESCO's work on AI ethics, policy, and in culture, science, and education, follow us at unesco.org. Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you in the next episode.